June 6, 1944, 4:30 hours. Along the cold, gray coast of Normandy, the sea was calm. Almost unnervingly so. Inside the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, German sentries peered into the fog. The horizon was empty, just an endless stretch of water and mist. For months, they had been told this fortress was impregnable. "No army can cross the channel," one sergeant had laughed the night before, sipping black coffee and listening to the hum of the coastal guns. Their uniforms were damp, their boots crusted with sand, but their confidence was unbroken. Then came the sound. At first, it was a faint rumble, distant, rhythmic, like thunder rolling over the ocean. It grew deeper, heavier, until the entire coast seemed to vibrate. As the mist lifted, dark shapes emerged, hundreds, then thousands of them. The laughter stopped. From Cherbourg to Cannes, German defenders watched in disbelief as the English Channel turned into a living armada. The invasion they mocked as impossible had arrived. In the years leading up to June 1944, Adolf Hitler's Germany had transformed Western Europe into a fortress. From the Arctic shores of Norway to the southern beaches of France, the Atlantic Wall stood as a colossal defensive barrier, a monument to German engineering, propaganda, and hubris. Built between 1942 and 1944, it stretched for more than 2,600 kilometers, armed with over 12,000 bunkers, 6 million mines, and countless anti-landing obstacles that the German High Command believed it was impenetrable. Hitler himself called it the Shield of Europe. Under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, thousands of soldiers, engineers, and conscripted laborers worked day and night to strengthen the defenses, concrete bunkers, pillboxes, artillery batteries, and tank traps forming a labyrinth along the French coast. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. German newsreels proudly showed soldiers patrolling the beaches, laughing as they posed beside massive coastal guns and concrete dragons' teeth. Posters declared that if the Allies ever attempted a landing, the sea itself would turn red before they set foot on French soil. For many soldiers stationed there, the months before D-Day were strangely quiet. They called it the Ghost Front. The long stretches of boredom were broken only by inspections, training exercises, and the occasional Allied air raid. Some of the older veterans, hardened by years of fighting in Russia or Africa, found the coastal assignment almost luxurious compared to the brutal Eastern Front. They had proper barracks, warm food, even time to write letters home. Rommel, however, was not convinced. He had seen what Allied air power and mobility could do in North Africa. He warned that if the enemy established a foothold, even the mighty Atlantic Wall would crumble. His solution was to crush the invasion at the water's edge. Tanks, artillery, and troops had to be ready to respond within minutes, not hours, but his superiors disagreed. The armored divisions were held further inland, under Hitler's personal control. Rommel's sense of urgency clashed with Berlin's rigid doctrine. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Allies were assembling the most ambitious invasion force in human history. Under Operation Overlord, more than 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 troops from the United States, Britain, and Canada prepared to cross the English Channel. Deception operations, Operation Fortitude, misled German intelligence into believing the invasion would strike Calais, not Normandy. Dummy tanks, fake radio chatter, and even inflatable armies kept the ruse alive. Back in the bunkers of Normandy, the defenders heard rumors of an impending invasion. But to most of them, it felt distant, a story for another time. They joked that the Allies wouldn't dare to face the Atlantic Wall head-on. The weather seemed to back them up. Fierce winds and high waves made a landing impossible in early June. Even Rommel, convinced the Allies would wait, took leave to visit his family for his wife's birthday. But the Allies had chosen the unthinkable. They would strike in the Storm Dot as dawn approached on June 6, 1944. The German outposts received the first fragments of alarming radio reports. Radar screens flickered with hundreds of contacts. Some believed it was a feint, perhaps another Allied deception. Others were paralyzed by disbelief. The first naval shells screamed through the fog at 5:45. Within minutes, batteries at Pointe du Hoc, Omaha, and Juneau were under siege. The Atlantic Wall, the fortress built on arrogance, was about to meet the unstoppable tide of reality. And as the horizon turned black with ships, one thought began to echo among the German ranks: what if we were wrong? For the German soldiers in Normandy, June 6, 1944, was not only a military catastrophe, it was a psychological collapse. For years, they had been told that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, a symbol of German engineering and Hitler's genius. Every propaganda poster, every speech from Goebbels, reinforced the belief that no enemy could ever set foot on occupied France. But when the morning sky over Normandy turned black with Allied aircraft, that illusion shattered inside the bunkers. Men of the Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine, many barely 19 years old, faced the unimaginable. The ground shook continuously from naval bombardment. Bunkers filled with dust, concrete splinters, and smoke. Some soldiers cried out prayers. Others stared silently, waiting for the moment when the steel doors would be blown apart. When the first landing craft appeared, their instinct wasn't confidence, it was disbelief. The scale was overwhelming. Thousands of ships, a horizon of movement. Many defenders reported feeling as if the entire ocean was advancing toward them. Those who survived the bombardment found themselves in an inferno. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels overheated, their hands blistered from the heat. Ammunition runners were cut down before reaching the bunkers. One veteran from the 352nd Infantry later said, "We didn't fight men that day, we fought a storm." Among the officers, chaos spread. Field telephones went dead, radio operators were killed, and command posts vanished under direct hits. In many sectors, there was no command structure left at all, only scattered pockets of men fighting on instinct. The German defensive strategy was fatally flawed. Rommel had warned that the invasion must be stopped on the beach itself, before the Allies could land their armor. But Hitler's orders had split the German command. The panzer divisions, their most powerful weapon, were held inland, under direct control from Berlin. This delay turned the initial hours into a one-sided slaughter. By the time Hitler was finally informed and authorized their movement, the roads were already under Allied air control. Tanks and convoys that tried to move during daylight were annihilated from the sky. The once feared German war machine was now paralyzed, crushed by speed, surprise, and precision. Even where local counterattacks succeeded, such as elements of the 21st Panzer Division reaching the coast near Cannes, they lacked air cover, artillery support, and coordination. What should have been a coherent defense dissolved into fragmented resistance beyond tactics and weapons. D-Day was a psychological turning point. German soldiers began to grasp that they were not fighting just another front. They were fighting the end of their world. Rumors spread rapidly. British paratroopers were everywhere. American armor was rolling off the beaches. Entire divisions were vanishing. Some German units fought to the last man, driven by duty, fear, or loyalty. Others, particularly the conscripts from Eastern Europe, forced into German service, surrendered at the first opportunity. In occupied towns, French civilians cautiously emerged from hiding. They saw German soldiers retreating, something they hadn't witnessed since 1940, the myth of Nazi invincibility, carefully constructed over years of propaganda, disintegrated in real time, inside command bunkers. Officers who once boasted of total war now argued over who would take the blame. Many knew the truth. Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, only when. Amid the chaos, there were moments of strange humanity. A wounded German medic reportedly crawled across the battlefield to treat both Allied and German soldiers. A captured paratrooper shared his canteen with a young German sentry who had lost his nerve. Even in destruction, soldiers on both sides recognized each other's fear. For the Germans, these fleeting acts of compassion contrasted sharply with the orders they had been taught to obey. No surrender, no mercy. But by dusk on June 6th, those words had lost their power. The soldiers who survived the day were no longer fighting for the Führer or the Reich. They were fighting to stay alive. As the sun set over Normandy, the beaches were littered with wreckage, tanks half buried in sand, helmets floating in tide pools, the bodies of friend and foe alike. The wind carried the smell of smoke and salt across the water. And for the men who once believed in an unbreakable wall, one thought haunted them all. The enemy was here, and he was never leaving. While the beaches of Normandy were consumed by chaos, the true disaster for Germany was unfolding hundreds of kilometers away, inside its command centers, in the corridors of power where arrogance, denial, and obsession ruled over reason. The German High Command, the Oberkommando, der Wehrmacht, OKW, had become a web of conflicting loyalties and fear. At its center stood Adolf Hitler, a man whose authority was absolute, yet whose perception of reality was increasingly detached. His generals no longer dared to contradict him, and the cost of hesitation was measured in thousands of lives. In the days leading to June 6th, reports from the French coast had hinted at unusual Allied activity. Yet within Hitler's headquarters at the Berghof and later the Wolf's Lair, the prevailing belief was that the main Allied invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Even as the first bombs fell and paratroopers landed behind enemy lines, key staff officers dismissed the events as a diversion, a feint meant to draw attention away from the real attack still to come. When confirmation finally reached the Führer in the early hours of June 6th, he was asleep. His staff hesitated to wake him. It was 10 a.m. before he learned that the invasion was real, a delay that would cost the German army the ability to respond decisively. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B and responsible for defending the French coastline, had been one of the few to recognize the coming storm. His experience in North Africa had taught him that once the enemy established a beachhead, the war would be lost. He had spent months urging Hitler to position the panzer divisions close to the coast, ready to strike immediately, but his requests clashed with the theories of other, high-ranking generals like Gerd von Rundstedt, who believed the armored reserves should remain inland for a coordinated counterattack. Hitler, unable to choose, kept control of the armored divisions for himself. When D-Day came, this indecision paralyzed the entire chain of command. Adding to the irony, Rommel wasn't even in Normandy when the invasion began. He had traveled to Germany to visit his wife for her birthday and to personally plead with Hitler for more resources. As the Allies stormed the beaches, one of Germany's greatest field commanders was hours away, unable to intervene. The German command structure was rigid, fatally so. Every order required authorization from higher authorities, and field commanders had little autonomy. When the invasion began, frontline officers desperately radioed for permission to deploy tanks, launch counterattacks, or reposition troops. But without Hitler's direct approval, they were forced to wait. Meanwhile, Allied aircraft systematically targeted German communication lines, severing phone cables and destroying relay stations. Messages took hours to reach headquarters, and by the time orders came back, the situation on the ground had already changed. It was as if the German army was fighting blindfolded. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the atmosphere was surreal. Maps covered the walls. Colored pins marked divisions that no longer existed. Officers argued over reports, unsure which were real and which were outdated. Some clung to hope that Normandy was still a diversion, that Calais would soon be attacked by the real invasion force. This delusion persisted for weeks, a psychological refusal to accept that the decisive battle of the war was already lost. Hitler himself issued contradictory orders. One hour he demanded immediate counterattacks. The next he forbade movement until he was certain of Allied intentions. He ordered divisions to fight to the last man in positions that no longer existed. The German military machine, once a symbol of precision, had descended into paralysis. The success of Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception campaign, played directly into Hitler's delusion. False radio traffic, double agents, and inflatable tanks convinced German intelligence that a massive invasion force still waited across from Calais. Even as the beaches of Normandy became a graveyard of German soldiers, the High Command continued to withhold reinforcements, expecting a second real attack that never came. By the time the truth became undeniable, it was too late. The Allies had already landed over 150,000 troops, established supply lines, and begun moving inland. The German dream of pushing them back into the sea had evaporated. For many within the Wehrmacht, D-Day marked the moment their faith in Hitler shattered. Rommel himself confided to his staff that the war was lost. Rundstedt, when asked what should be done, simply replied, "Make peace, you fools." But peace was impossible. Dissent meant death. Even those who began to plot against Hitler, such as Rommel and other senior officers, did so quietly, knowing the regime they served would destroy them if discovered. The German High Command had created a system where truth was treason and obedience was suicide. D-Day exposed it in full light, and as the Allies advanced inland, the men who once believed themselves masters of Europe now watched their empire crumble from within. June 6, 1944, dawn over Normandy. A gray, silent horizon turned to fire. Allied battleships, stretched across the channel like a steel armada, opened their guns. For the men on the German side, it was as if the sea itself had come alive, roaring, shaking, consuming the very air with thunder. The long-feared invasion had begun. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing crafts reached the beaches. American, British, and Canadian troops surged toward the French coast in one of the largest amphibious assaults in human history. On the German defenses, thousands of soldiers, many young, untested, and exhausted from long months of waiting, faced the unimaginable. Machine guns rattled from concrete bunkers. Mortar rained on the incoming boats. At Omaha Beach, the slaughter was immediate. The German 352nd Infantry Division, well-trained and positioned on the cliffs, inflicted devastating casualties. Entire landing teams were wiped out before reaching cover. The sea turned red. Yet even in this moment of apparent triumph, cracks were already forming in the German defense. The sheer scale of the Allied assault, thousands of ships, planes, and men, overwhelmed communication lines. Bunkers fought in isolation. Batteries lost contact with command. And with Allied air power dominating the skies, any attempt to move reinforcements was instantly targeted and destroyed. The so-called Atlantic Wall, once touted as an impenetrable fortress stretching from Norway to the Pyrenees, revealed its truth that morning. It was a myth. Built in haste, underfunded, and manned by conscripts and foreign volunteers, it was never the superstructure of legend. Rommel had warned that without total commitment resources, the wall was little more than propaganda. Mines were missing. Bunkers were incomplete. Many gun emplacements pointed in the wrong direction. At Utah and Gold Beaches, Allied engineers cleared obstacles faster than the defenders could respond. By 9 a.m., breaches appeared across the coastline. The wall was not falling. It was disintegrating. Above the beaches, the true scale of Allied superiority revealed itself. More than 11,000 aircraft controlled the airspace. Every road, every bridge, every suspected movement of German armor was met with precision bombardment. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen, crippled by fuel shortages, outnumbered, and outclassed. In previous years, German troops had fought under skies ruled by their own eagles. But on this day, they fought under the shadow of Allied thunder. Fighter bombers swooped low, strafing convoys, shattering morale. For German soldiers, even the sky had turned against them. At Omaha Beach, where the cost of progress was measured in lives, the situation began to change. Small groups of American soldiers, pinned down, bloodied, leaderless, began to move. Crawling through the sand, they found paths between the machine gun nests. Engineers cleared gaps through barbed wire and mines. By midday, after hours of slaughter, the first units broke through. German defenders, cut off and running out of ammunition, began to fall back. For the first time, Allied troops reached the cliffs, the very heart of the German line. By afternoon, the impossible had happened. Omaha Beach was secured. Across the entire invasion front, from Utah to Sword, the story was the same. Brutal fighting, devastating losses, and yet steady, unstoppable progress. The Allies had come to stay. When Field Marshal Rommel finally returned to Normandy later that day, he was greeted by a scene that confirmed his darkest fears. The beaches, once defended by his divisions, were now teeming with Allied soldiers, vehicles, and artillery. His staff reported that more than 150,000 men had landed in a single day. The enemy had established beachheads at all 5 sectors. Reinforcements were already pouring in. And still, Hitler refused to release the panzer divisions held in reserve near Paris. Rommel stood in silence, staring at the horizon, the same one he had spent months fortifying. The myth of German invincibility had just drowned in the Channel. As night fell, the situation for Germany grew catastrophic. Allied paratroopers, scattered across the French countryside, seized key bridges and road junctions, cutting off routes for German reinforcements. Towns like Sainte-Mère-Église and Corentin became symbols of defiance, small but crucial victories that cemented the invasion's success. German officers radioed for orders. The responses were either silence or confusion. The High Command still debated whether Normandy was the main attack. No one dared make decisions without Hitler's approval. And Hitler still clung to the belief that the real invasion at Calais was yet to come. By the time approval came to release the panzers, the Allies had already entrenched their positions. The once vaunted Wehrmacht, the same army that had crushed France in weeks 4 years earlier, now found itself trapped, immobile, and outmaneuvered. By June 7th, German defenses across Normandy were collapsing. The Atlantic Wall, a monument to Nazi propaganda and engineering pride, had fallen in a single day. Entire battalions surrendered or retreated. Inland, under relentless bombardment, what remained of the German coastal divisions were ghosts, fragments of an army that had once believed itself untouchable. The tide of war had turned irrevocably. And deep inside Hitler's bunker, disbelief gave way to fury. Orders for counterattacks were issued that could no longer be carried out. The war that had begun with blitzkrieg now faced a slow grinding and inevitable defeat. June 7, 1944. Dawn over Cannes. The morning mist hung low over the Norman fields. German tanks, painted with the black cross of the Wehrmacht, rolled out from the tree lines, slow, deliberate, but already too late. Dust and exhaust filled the air as the rumble of engines echoed across the countryside. This was the long-awaited German counterattack. But the war had changed, and so had the battlefield. Inside Hitler's headquarters at the Berghof, chaos reigned. Reports of the invasion were contradictory. Some officers insisted that Normandy was only a diversion. Others begged for permission to unleash the panzers. Hitler, convinced that the main attack would come at Pas-de-Calais, refused to commit his armored reserves. For nearly 15 critical hours, the German army waited. Rommel, who had argued for immediate counterattacks at the beaches, was away visiting his wife for her birthday when the invasion began. When he returned to Normandy that evening, his fury was quiet but unmistakable. By then, the Allies had landed more than 150,000 men and over 20,000 vehicles. Every hour of delay had strengthened the beachheads and weakened Germany's chance of pushing them back into the sea. Finally, at dawn on June 7th, Hitler authorized the armored divisions to move. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned near Cannes, was ordered to drive the British into the sea. Its tanks, Panzer IVs, and a handful of Panthers rolled toward the coast, but the skies betrayed them. Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted the movement almost immediately. Within minutes, hundreds of Typhoon fighter bombers descended like hawks, unleashing rockets and bombs on the advancing columns. The German counterattack was torn apart before it even reached the beaches. Still, some tanks broke through. Near Perrier's Ridge, they clashed with British paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division. Outnumbered and outgunned, the British held their ground long enough for naval guns offshore to join the fight. The sea roared again, this time not with waves, but with 15-inch shells that turned the fields into firestorms. The German counterattack faltered, if D-Day proved anything. It was this: the side that ruled the skies ruled the ground. German soldiers moved only at night, terrified of the constant drone of Allied aircraft. Convoys that once maneuvered with confidence now hugged hedgerows or abandoned their vehicles altogether. In contrast, Allied logistics flowed like a machine. Ships unloaded men, tanks, and supplies around the clock. Engineers constructed artificial harbors, mulberry harbors, at Arromanches and Omaha, enabling a constant stream of reinforcements. Within days, more than 326,000 troops had landed in France. For the Germans, this was an entirely new kind of warfare, one they could neither match nor stop. By June 10th, Rommel met with other commanders near La Roche-Guyon. The meeting was tense. The Allied bridgehead was expanding, and German casualties were rising rapidly. Rommel argued that without air cover or freedom of movement, the Wehrmacht could not sustain the fight. He urged Hitler to negotiate, to recognize the reality that the Western Front could not be held. But Hitler's response was pure defiance. He ordered every man to fight to the last bullet, every tank to counterattack regardless of losses. The gulf between the men at the front and the man in Berlin had become absolute. In the following weeks, the city of Cannes became the focal point of brutal, unrelenting combat. For the Germans, it was the key to holding Normandy. For the Allies, it was the gateway to breaking through. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler-Jugend, made up of fanatical young soldiers, defended the city with ferocity. British and Canadian forces launched multiple assaults. Each time, they were met with disciplined resistance. Buildings collapsed under shell fire, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Yet even in their determination, the German defenders were fighting a losing battle. Their supply lines were shattered. Ammunition ran low. Reinforcements never came. What held Cannes was not strategy, it was pride. By late June, Allied superiority was overwhelming. The Germans were being crushed not by numbers alone, but by momentum. Every counterattack bled them dry. Every delay cost them ground. The panzer divisions, which had once dominated Europe, were now trapped in a battlefield that offered no room to maneuver and no sky to hide under. Rommel, wounded in mid-July when his car was strafed by an Allied aircraft, would never see the outcome. His absence left a vacuum of leadership, just as the Allies prepared their next great push, Operation Cobra. Meanwhile, Hitler continued to issue impossible orders from hundreds of miles away, demanding counteroffensives that could no longer be executed. The once feared German war machine had become a shadow of itself, a rigid command structure unable to adapt to the new realities of mechanized, air-dominated warfare. By early August, the German line in Normandy was collapsing completely. Trapped in the Falaise pocket, tens of thousands of soldiers were surrounded and destroyed. It was the largest German defeat in the West since 1940, and it broke the back of the Wehrmacht's hold on France. The dream of defending Fortress Europe had died on the same beaches where it had been born, The Atlantic Wall had fallen. The Luftwaffe was crippled. The panzer divisions were shattered. And from that moment on, the war in the West would never again be fought on German terms. The invasion of Normandy was not just the beginning of liberation, it was the beginning of Germany's end. The smoke still rose over the beaches when Allied troops began their push inland toward Paris. Winter came early in 1944, cold, gray, and unforgiving. Across the front, Allied soldiers dug into frozen soil, staring toward a Germany that refused to die. What had begun on the beaches of Normandy now pressed against the borders of the Reich itself. Hitler's empire, once stretching from the Pyrenees to the gates of Moscow, had been reduced to a scarred, burning shell. Yet its leaders still raved in underground bunkers, convinced that one last counterstrike could turn back the tide. In December 1944, the world witnessed Germany's final breath of defiance, the Battle of the Bulge, under a blanket of fog and snow. The Wehrmacht launched a surprise assault through the Ardennes forest, the same route it had used in 1940 to crush France. Hitler called it the last roll of the dice. For weeks, chaos consumed the Western Front. American divisions at Bastogne were surrounded, their supplies cut off. The cold was merciless. Soldiers froze in foxholes, firing blindly through the snow. German panzers advanced farther than anyone expected, creating a massive bulge in the Allied lines. But the attack lacked fuel, coordination, and the strength of years past. When the skies cleared, Allied air power struck back. Thousands of bombers filled the winter sky, turning the roads of retreat into graveyards of steel. The bulge collapsed by late January 1945. Leaving behind over 100,000 German casualties. It was a desperate final act, a futile attempt to rewrite the inevitable. From that point forward, Germany's war machine was finished out by March 1945. Allied forces reached the Rhine River, the last natural barrier before the heart of Germany. The Germans had destroyed most bridges, but at Remagen, one remained intact, a mistake that sealed their fate. American troops stormed across the Ludendorff Bridge, establishing a bridgehead inside Germany. For the first time, Allied soldiers set foot on enemy soil, staring across landscapes shattered by years of war. Villages lay in ruins. Civilians wandered in silence, their eyes hollow from hunger and fear. The propaganda that had once glorified the Reich was now replaced by whispers of betrayal, starvation, and hopelessness. Entire cities like Dresden were reduced to ashes. Millions of refugees fled the east as the Red Army approached, desperate to escape both the bombs and the vengeance they knew was coming. By April, the Allies closed in from all sides. The British and Americans advanced from the west, while Soviet tanks thundered in from the east. Hitler refused to surrender, retreating into his bunker beneath the ruined streets of Berlin. Above him, the once proud capital of the Reich had become a wasteland, blackened stone, smoke, and the sound of artillery echoing through empty streets. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life, ending the dictatorship that had plunged Europe into chaos. A week later, on May 8, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, but peace did not come easily. The world that emerged from the rubble was unrecognizable. The Normandy invasion had been more than a military operation. It was a turning point in human history. It shattered the myth of totalitarian invincibility and proved that cooperation between nations could defeat tyranny. The beaches where so many had fallen became sacred ground, symbols of unity forged through unimaginable sacrifice. The soldiers who stormed the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc and the fields of Normandy did not fight for conquest, they fought for liberation. And in doing so, they laid the foundation for a new world order. From the ashes of Europe, new alliances were born. The United Nations took shape in 1945, a direct attempt to prevent the horrors of another world war. The Marshall Plan soon followed, rebuilding a broken continent through cooperation instead of vengeance. Yet the scars ran deep. Entire generations were lost. Families waited for sons who would never return. Towns were rebuilt, but the trauma lingered in silence, in the empty chairs at dinner tables. The missing names on war memorials, the haunted eyes of those who survived. For Germany, the reckoning was both moral and material. Cities had to be rebuilt, but so too did a national conscience. The Nuremberg trials began later that year, holding the architects of the Reich accountable for crimes the world could barely comprehend. In the end, D-Day was not merely a victory, it was the beginning of Europe's rebirth. It redefined courage, unity, and the meaning of freedom. The beaches of Normandy stand today, not as monuments to war, but as reminders of the cost of peace. The Allied soldiers who landed there carried the torch of humanity into a continent shrouded in darkness. Their victory lit the path toward recovery, democracy, and the fragile peace that followed. The world they left behind was scarred, but alive. And from that broken ground, a new Europe began to rise. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was not merely liberated, it was hollowed out. Entire nations stood among ruins, their cities gutted, their men displaced. Among the millions drifting through the wreckage were German prisoners of war, once proud soldiers of the Reich, now captives of the New Order. For them, the fall of Hitler's empire was not just defeat, it was a slow awakening. Across Allied camps in France, Britain, and the United States, millions of German Poles awaited their uncertain fate. Many were young, barely 20, indoctrinated from childhood to believe in the Reich's invincibility. They had fought for an empire that no longer existed, for a Führer now dead in a Berlin bunker. The Allies treated most prisoners humanely, though conditions varied. In the American Midwest, Poles worked on farms, often forming quiet friendships with local families who saw them less as monsters and more as misguided men. Some even stayed after the war, marrying and settling in the lands they once viewed as enemies. But others, particularly those held by the Soviets, faced a far darker fate. In the East, millions were marched into labor camps, rebuilding what their armies had destroyed. For them, repatriation took years. Some would not return home until 1955, 10 years after the guns had stopped. Those who did return came back to a nation unrecognizable. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin lay in ruins. The Reich's banners were gone, replaced by the flags of occupation. The men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler now faced a haunting question. What had it all been for? As the Allies occupied Germany, the seeds of a new conflict were already being sown. The United States, Britain, and France administered the Western zones, while the Soviet Union held the East. What began as cooperation quickly hardened into suspicion. The ideological chasm between capitalism and communism turned Germany itself into the front line of the Cold War. In 1949, the nation split in two: the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The same country that once sought to dominate Europe was now divided by barbed wire and political ideology. Yet from the ruins, something remarkable emerged. In the West, under the guidance of Allied administrators and the flow of American aid, democracy took root. Factories reopened, schools were rebuilt, and cities rose from the ashes. Much of this resurgence came through the Marshall Plan, introduced in 1948, a massive U.S. initiative that poured over $13 billion into European recovery. It was not just money. It was a message. The future would be rebuilt not through conquest, but cooperation. Ironically, the same men who once fought to destroy Europe's unity became instrumental in rebuilding it. Former Poles returned with new perspectives, having seen firsthand the humanity of their former enemies. Many became teachers, engineers, or civil servants in the new democratic Germany. Their experiences abroad softened the militaristic pride that had fueled the Reich. They became advocates for moderation, reconciliation, and progress. Some historians later called them the lost generation that found Germany again. The influence of the Allies extended far beyond economics. American jazz filled the airwaves. French philosophy shaped new intellectual movements. British governance inspired the parliamentary structures of the new West German state. Even Hollywood films, once banned under the Nazis, became symbols of freedom, creativity, and cultural renewal, but memory lingered. The war had not only destroyed nations, it had fractured souls. Across Germany, silence settled over the past. Many avoided discussing what had happened, focusing instead on rebuilding. Yet by the 1950s and 60s, a new generation began to ask questions their parents refused to answer. The Nuremberg trials, which had begun in 1945, left a lasting imprint on global conscience. For the first time, the world declared that leaders could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. That idea, born in the ashes of war, would shape international law for decades to come. In time, remembrance became part of reconciliation. The cemeteries of Normandy, where white crosses stretched toward the horizon, became places not of bitterness, but of shared mourning. German veterans returned quietly, laying wreaths beside those of their former enemies. The war that had divided them in life began to unite them in memory. As the 1950s dawned, Europe stood on the threshold of a new era. The guns were silent, but a new tension gripped the continent. The standoff between East and West. NATO was formed in 1949, with West Germany joining a few years later. Across the Iron Curtain, the Warsaw Pact rose in response. The same soil that once saw the blood of D-Day would now host missiles, tanks, and soldiers on alert, this time for a war that never came. Yet beneath that uneasy peace, a quiet miracle unfolded. The transformation of Germany, from a symbol of destruction into a cornerstone of stability. It was a rebirth born from defeat, guided by remembrance and sustained by the lessons of Normandy. The tide that washed over Normandy on June 6, 1944, did more than liberate a continent. It rewrote the story of the modern world. In the decades since, historians, soldiers, and civilians alike have tried to grasp what that day truly meant. To the men who stormed the beaches, it was survival. To the world that watched, it was hope. But to history itself, D-Day was the turning of an age when tyranny began to crumble, and freedom found its voice again. For the German defenders who once stood on the Atlantic Wall, D-Day was the moment their illusion of invincibility shattered. They realized, perhaps too late, that no empire built on fear could withstand a coalition built on faith. Faith in liberty, in humanity, in something greater than the flag above them. The years that followed were shaped by that understanding. Europe's cities, once scarred by bombs and barbed wire, became symbols of renewal. Nations that had faced each other through the sights of rifles would one day sit together in councils, building a union of peace. The sons of those who fought at Normandy would grow up under a sky no longer divided by warplanes, but by airliners carrying diplomats and dreamers. The memory of June 6th endures not as a celebration of victory, but as a reminder of what it cost. Over 4,000 Allied soldiers fell that day, young men who crossed oceans to die on foreign sand. Their sacrifice was not for conquest, but for conviction that freedom, once threatened, must always be defended. Today, the beaches remain quiet. The wind still carries the salt of the Channel, the same wind that once whipped across the helmets of men climbing those cliffs. Tourists walk where soldiers bled, children laugh where mortar once fell. Yet the silence holds a pulse, the echo of courage, duty, and the fragility of peace. History may fade, but its lessons remain. D-Day was not only the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, it was the beginning of a new world, one built not on domination, but on unity. And so, as the waves of Normandy break endlessly against the shore, They whisper the same eternal truth. Freedom is never given. It is earned, defended, and remembered.